Well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad you're here. I'm so glad that Reverend Gabe Byron can be with us this morning after all our many, many months of planning for this day. So this is lovely that we're all gathered. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Byron's background. She's a professor of New Testament and early Christianity at Howard University. And she's also the stated supply pastor at Northminster Presbyterian in Washington, D.C. I got my churches mixed up. So Dr. Byron is going to be talking to us this morning about the Ordinance of Christianity in ancient Ethiopia and how this historical framework illuminates our understanding of the New Testament. And as she said, we're going to look at the book of Acts, chapter 8, verses 26 through 40. And she's going to lead us in a discussion, I think an active discussion of that topic. Dr. Byron, we welcome you and look forward to your talk.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me into your virtual space, which is also different from being able to walk from room to room in our respective churches. So there's a lot to coordinate. So I thank God for all of your coordination. And good morning again. I just want to extend my deep gratitude to Noel for reaching out to me several months ago. Possibly it could even be a year at this point, when we started trying to secure a date for my sharing here at your church. And then COVID hit back in the spring. I was supposed to come back in April, and then we had to postpone that. And so now just searching for a date and a time has finally come to fruition. So I am so delighted to be with you this morning. My scholarship in New Testament studies focuses on the origins of Christianity in ancient Ethiopia. So what I intend to share with you this morning are some reflections and some insights that I've gathered over the years around this topic, ancient Ethiopia and the New Testament. So at this time, I want to go ahead and put up some slides here. And would you confirm if you're able to see these slides with a thumb up or what have you? So our topic this morning is ancient Ethiopia and the New Testament. And specifically, I want us to reflect on two main questions. And you'll see these in the bullet points there on the slides. I want us to think about, why does the Ethiopian come among us? And that is in biblical texts, but also when we think about Ethiopians, it actually in the ancient world, Ethiopians referred to Blacks and Blackness. So we want to think about, why does the Ethiopian come among us? And then what does this mean for the church today? So I have two big working questions. And with that in mind, this session will focus on the origins of Christianity in ancient Ethiopia. And we will look at texts such as Acts chapter 8, verses 26 to 40, which specifically deals with the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch. And when we talk about Ethiopia, it raises all kinds of questions, because invariably it forces us to talk about Nubia and the Axumite Empire of ancient Ethiopia. And these are terms and places that we usually don't think about when we read our Bibles, and especially when we read the New Testament. So we're going to start looking at empires beyond the Roman Empire. And I'm bringing this up because the basic landscape for understanding early Christianity and for interpreting the New Testament, of course, is the lens of the Roman Empire, primarily through the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul, as we find in Acts, the book of Acts. All of Acts is dealing with these three primary missionary journeys of Paul. But I want to put on the table for us today to consider that there was much more going on in early Christianity beyond what the Apostle Paul was doing, okay? And therefore that takes us into places and people who descend from Africa. So we're going beyond the Roman Empire. And then we have to ask the question, which Ethiopia? If you heard, I mentioned Nubia, I've mentioned Axum, and all of these are subsumed under the title Ethiopia. So we want to explore a bit, what do we mean when we even talk about Ethiopia as it refers to the New Testament? And then I'll share a bit with you from one of my publications, Symbolic, Blackness, and Ethnic Difference in Early Christianity. And I want us to think about, what does symbolic Blackness mean when it comes to interpreting the New Testament? And I also want us to think about redrawing the boundaries of early Christianity. And we do this by actually looking at Ethiopic sources and by engaging a whole different language world known as Ge'ez. Okay? And so I'm just putting a lot of terminology out there for you. That's why I did create this slideshow, so that we can begin to build a whole new vocabulary or a whole new lexicon for how we think about the New Testament. And so some sample biblical texts that we'll allude to this morning would come from Psalm 68, verse 31. That's a passage that, remember, so you can, it mentions both Egypt and Ethiopia. Psalm 68, verse 31. And in that passage, it says, envoys will come from Egypt and Ethiopia, or Cush. In the Old Testament, Ethiopia is often referred to as Cush, C-U-S-H. Cush will submit herself to God, or another translation says, Ethiopia will stretch forth her hands to God. So that's Psalm 68:31. Then there's also the Acts 8 text I've alluded to, but Acts 8 is connected to Acts chapter 1, verse 8. And that's where at the beginning of the book of Acts, and I think that one may be worth taking a look at. That's when we see the setup for how this new Christian movement was to expand. In Acts chapter 1, verse 8, the scripture says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. To the ends of the earth. That is a marker for how far Christianity can extend. It first starts locally in Jerusalem, then it moves out to the provinces of Judea and Samaria, but then ultimately Christianity is to extend to the ends of the earth. And what better symbolizes the ends of the earth than the Ethiopian? And so that Ethiopian conversion story, or baptism, more accurately, the baptism account of the Ethiopian, exemplifies the far reach of early Christianity. And then there's references in 1 Kings chapter 10 to the Queen of Sheba. She's also connected to Ethiopia in our Hebrew Bible. And I always love, since we're looking at the book of Acts, we will not have time to go through all of these references today, but I'm glad this is being recorded and you can follow up on this in your own time if you're so interested. But Acts 21, verses 27 to 39, there is a story about the Apostle Paul being mistaken for an Egyptian. And that's deep into the book of Acts, Acts 21, verses 27 to 39. But Luke, the author of Acts, portrays Paul as this revolutionary type leader who was about to be imprisoned and even put to death. And he confused Paul with an Egyptian. Now, I know when you normally think about the Apostle Paul, you don't think Egyptian, right? So that gets back to my whole notion about symbolic Blackness and why these different ethnic groups are showing up in these early Christian writings. And so ultimately, this morning, I want us to have some time to just talk about what does all of this mean for the church today, especially in this heightened socio-cultural, political environment where not only have we been in a pandemic, but we've also gone through a very heightened season of protest with the Black Lives Matter movement going on. And I think the church and the faithful people of God must be equipped to engage the different cultural and political issues that are taking place in the world around us. And so those are the kinds of things I want us to think about today. But to get us started, for me, it's always important for us to actually see a map of Ethiopia. Like I said, we tend to always focus around the Mediterranean context of early Christianity. We focus around the Roman Empire. But I want to take us to Ethiopia this morning. And here's a contemporary map of Ethiopia with the capital, of course, Addis Ababa, right in the center of this very large country here. And when we talk about the Axumite Empire, you see this, I don't know if you all can see my pointer, but if you go to the northern part of the country, there's Axum. You see that? And this region in the northern part of what's known as the Tigray region, and a little bit of the southern tip of Yemen, as well as all of what is now Eritrea, all of this northern part. So you see how the Axumite Empire sat along the Red Sea. You see that? And that's very important for us to have this geographical lens etched in our minds as we're reading biblical texts, so that we can remember that we're not along the Mediterranean right now. The major seacoast and point of reference is the Red Sea, not to mention the Nile River, but I'll show you another slide to take into account there. And then, of course, modern day Sudan, right, is adjacent to Ethiopia. So I'd like to put this map up to help us get situated in what is known as the Axumite Empire, and also what is known as Nubia in the ancient world. Nubia was modern day Sudan. Okay. So let me just pop another image here. So now here's another slide featuring the Axumite Empire. And now you can see the Red Sea more prominently. Now you can see Nubia. And remember the map I just showed you? That's Sudan right here, sitting next to Axum. Also, the northern border of Sudan, of course, is Egypt. So I like putting these maps up just to help us to start to reorient our whole geographical landscape for how we think about the backdrop, and especially the historical backdrop of biblical narratives. So we have and here's another map of Nubia proper. So you see now with the Nile River going on here, right? And then there's a lower Nubia in the northern part of the ancient Nubia. See, that's where we're working with terminology now. Because if we look at a map today, you're not going to see Nubia on a map today. You will see Sudan. And so that's how Ethiopia gets lost, if you will. It gets subsumed into Egypt. I'm just going to go back to this map. Ethiopia gets subsumed into all of the information we have about Egypt, because Egypt was a part of the Roman Empire. the northern part of Egypt. So it made it into a lot of the biblical narratives. But the only reference in the New Testament, not to mention Axum, but to the New Testament, that refers to Nubia comes from the story in Acts 8 about the Ethiopian eunuch. So he's given the general title of being an Ethiopian eunuch. But now you all know this Ethiopian actually comes from Sudan, or more accurately, in his ancient context, he comes from this city here. He comes from Nubia, and more specifically, he comes from Meroe. And we know that the Ethiopian eunuch comes from Meroe because, and this is where we need to look at our text here a bit. If you go, so it starts out at verse 26. The angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza." And this is a wilderness road. That's very important. So Philip got up and he went. And now, this is verse 27, there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. That, my friends, is the clue that this Ethiopian eunuch was representing a Kandake. K-A-N, I don't have a slide for this, K-A-N-D-A-K-E, Kandake, is the Greek term for the Ethiopian, or for Candace, excuse me, for Candace. So we see Kandake translated in our English versions of the Bible as Candace. And so we think, oh, so there was some queen, because she is mentioned as a queen of the Ethiopians, by the name of Candace. Well, actually, there was a long lineage of Kandake, not just one, but 8 to 10 Kandake in the ancient world. And so my current scholarship now is getting at who are the Kandake, because that lets us know that this Ethiopian wasn't just randomly traveling along. He was on a mission, and he was on a mission for one of the queens of Ethiopia, Kandake Amantateri, to be exact, to say her name. And the Kandake ruled in this region of Nubia known as Meroe. And that's how we situate where this Ethiopian eunuch came from. And he came from a very prominent and powerful place, representing a very powerful queen, a long lineage of queens at that. Okay, so I like to make that point because when we typically, and this image you have before you now, is basically some art that was actually used in Sunday school curriculum. Okay, now mind you, it was back in the 50s or 60s, but nevertheless, that's how some were introduced to the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. Now, if you look at this image, do you think Ethiopia? Do you think Africa? Do you think Blackness when you look at this image? And this is what drew me into this line of research and in this line of trying to understand what's going on with the Ethiopian eunuch. Now here, we get a little more flesh and a little more color, right, on our Ethiopian. Okay, so now he's humbly sitting down, and we don't have time to read through the whole text right now. We can talk about this in our Q&A session. But now we can see the very submissive, humble Ethiopian on his knees with Philip, but he's, of course, now dark-skinned, and he does have some Africanness about himself. And Philip is standing over, offering a baptism of this Ethiopian. But as I have written about in my own scholarship revolving around this text, that once we hear this baptism story in Acts 8, we don't hear anything more about the Ethiopian. We don't hear anything more about Candace, the queen whom he was represented. And we certainly don't hear anything about the land that he came from, Nubia, which would help us to understand a whole new trajectory of Christianity. And so my scholarship basically focuses upon the ethnic context and the racialized subtext within the study of the New Testament. Because clearly there were other contexts beyond the Roman Empire, ethnic contexts, we can call them. And clearly there had to be some type of racialized subtext that is buried in the scholarship on this passage that gets in the way of us being able to understand the true African origins of early Christianity. And therefore, I introduce all of my classes and now my Bible studies, or whenever I talk about the ancient world, I do it by this whole notion of redrawing the boundaries and helping us to open up beyond the Roman imperial framework, which is the image on the right of the slide before you. And we look both at the Roman Empire and the Axumite Empire. And that's why I have this slide to the left. So it's really a notion of redrawing the boundaries, opening up our geographical purview. When we look at the ancient world, when we study the ancient world, having an awareness that there is more than one storyline within the New Testament. There were multiple storylines of different leaders within the New Testament and within early Christianity. And so we want to find ways to be able to get at these different stories and representations of early Christian movements. And therefore, my book is titled Symbolic Blackness, an Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature. And that is where I have this image of the Ethiopian eunuch actually on the cover of my book, because it certainly depicts the kind of symbolic representations that we find of not only Ethiopians, but also Egyptians and Blacks in the ancient world. So this study looks at the rhetorical or literary representations of Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Blacks, and I name what is known as ethno-political rhetoric in these early Christian sources. And at the time when I did this work, which goes all the way back to when I was working on my dissertation project or my dissertation research, beyond a project research at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. And that was 20 years ago that I was working on this. And it is still being used today. More and more colleagues and scholars are now aware of the rich ethnic diversity in early Christianity. And we are still deeply engaged in this type of scholarship and discourse. But my dissertation research focused only on Greek and Latin sources. right? The sources of the classical Greco-Roman world. And my basic thesis was that there were certain groups of Christians who were effectively blackened by their sins. And that's an actual quote from one of the early church fathers, Jerome, who used Ethiopians and Egyptians, and we find this in all types of early Christian literature, to point out the heresies within communities, to point out the outsiders within communities, to point out the sexual vices within communities. When these early Christian writers wanted to do that, they would develop rhetorical arguments using Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Blacks. Okay, so I studied this as a literary rhetorical trope, if you will, for my dissertation research. But then the big question, as you can see on the bottom of the slide, what about the other side of the story? What was going on with the Ethiopians themselves? What was going on in Nubia? What was going on in Axum? The Axumite Empire was thriving at the same time as the Roman Empire. But all I had access to when I was going through my New Testament Ph.D. program was primarily Greek and Latin sources. And so in order to get to the other side of the story, we must engage in the sources and manuscripts from Ethiopia itself. And in order to do that, it's incumbent upon students to be exposed to ancient Ethiopic, which is actually Ge'ez. And so I have it up on the screen. This is the Ge'ez alphabet. I like to just put it up so that students can, and adult students like yourself, can begin to think about, there's a whole different language world out there. There are hundreds and thousands of other manuscripts that haven't even been introduced into the study of the New Testament. Why? Because we typically focus on the Greek and Roman sources through the use of Greek and Latin. Okay, and so that's yet another one of my basic propositions, is that we must go beyond the Greco-Roman landscape. And I just want to inform this particular class that the School of Divinity at Howard University actually has a collection of Ethiopian artifacts and manuscripts. It's known as the Andre Reynolds Tweed Collection. It was donated to the School of Divinity in 1993, just prior to Dr. Tweed passing away. He wanted to leave his rich collection of Ethiopian artifacts and manuscripts with a school, a reputable school, where he thought the material would be used for scholarship and curated for educational purposes. And so we have a total of 240 artifacts, which includes 150 manuscripts, codices, and scrolls. And my scholarship is primarily focused around this one manuscript known as Tweed Manuscript 150. And this is the Acts of Paul, the Acts of Paul. You've heard me talk a lot about Paul this morning. And there is what's known as a Gedla Paulos, where we can begin to see that there were other traditions of early Christianity and manifestations of Christian engagements of biblical texts beyond what we have in our Greek-based New Testament. And I think it's just important for us to begin to just open up our worldview, open up a framework for entertaining how do we bring extra canonical sources like these later Ethiopic manuscripts in conversation with our biblical sources. And so here we have, I have a list of references to Egypt and Ethiopia in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And you can see how these different names come up. So Egypt is referred to as Mitzrayim. Ethiopia in the Old Testament is referred to as Cush, and you see all of the different references here. And there are times when Egypt and Ethiopia are used together in a passage, and that goes back to that Psalm 68, verse 31 passage I read a little earlier. So I just want to just show these to you, and we can decide how we want to go forth. In the New Testament, there are not a lot of references to Egypt and Ethiopia, and that's why when I was first starting my research, it was a little difficult making a case for focusing on these symbolic representations of Egypt and Ethiopia and Blacks and early Christian writers, because when it comes to writings, because when it comes to the New Testament, basically we have the mention of the story of when Joseph and Mary had to go into exile in Egypt in Matthew 2, and also in Acts chapter 2, verse 10, and what I've shown you earlier, those are references to Egypt in the New Testament. And then, as I've already now helped you to understand, that when we hear Ethiopia, it is so important that we name which Ethiopia, right? So are we in Nubia? Are we in Axum? Are we in the Old Testament period when they refer to Ethiopia as Cush? Which Ethiopia? What time frame? And then ultimately we ask ourselves, why? Why does the Ethiopian come among us? And those are the kinds of things that I want us to think about as we move now into our discussion session. Why does the Ethiopian come among us? What difference does this make for the life of the church today? You know, so many times when I go and do these talks, it can kind of sound like, oh, okay, this is very interesting, but what does this actually really have to do with our own church context? I'm not able to see all of the faces on the screen right now since I have the slideshow up, but I don't know how many Africans or African Americans you have in your congregation. But it's important that we find ways of looking at the full landscape, the full geographical and cultural and even political landscape of our biblical texts. Because I contend that by looking at the full landscape of the sources that inform our faith, we can then be able to look at the full landscape of the world around us, the society in which we live today. Why are there so many disparities? Why is there such partisan politics? And I mean, we know of the history of the whole political system and how it was developed. But why is it still lingering well into the 21st century? Where you would think we were still back in the Jim Crow era. Let's keep it real, okay? And until we do the kind of problematizing that we need to do with the very sources that inform our faith, we won't be able to get to what's at the heart of the differences that continue to exist among us today. So this is basically a talk about difference and the dignity of differences, the power of differences, and how we can use these not as liabilities, but as strengths. How do we capitalize on the fact that, oh, okay, there is the Sudan out there, and there is Nubia, and there is Egypt, and there is Ethiopia, and there is Axum, because now you have the language for this now. And I can leave some of these slides with you so you can have the maps and you can search this up for yourself. But what really happens if we put both of these slides up at the same time? I don't think anybody's fallen out of their seats yet, right? This doesn't hurt to open up a little bit and begin to say, oh, the Mediterranean Sea, as big and beautiful as it is, and I certainly want to get to a lot of these different sea coasts along the Mediterranean. But look at there, look, there's another whole sea basin, if you will, with trade routes and a lot of activity that was going on in the ancient world as well. Why not put it all on the table? Why not explore why the Ethiopian just disappears? So we have this wonderful baptism account, but then we don't get anything more other than these little scant references here and there.
So, Gay,
Yes.
has Christianity persisted in Ethiopia from that time on, or did it has? Because when
It has. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church today, there are communities gathered today in Washington, D.C. and around the world using Ge'ez
Was there
for their liturgy.